Welcome back to The Real News. I'm Kim Brown. I'm still joined on the line with Linda Miller and Patrick Arenz. They are both attorneys representing Pania Vang. This is a woman who was raped by an American in her home country of Laos and was able to recoup damages. She was awarded almost $1 million by a federal jury in connection to her sexual assault. And Patrick and Linda, again, obviously this is unprecedented. We've not seen an outcome like this on behalf of a victim of sex tourism. And I'm curious because what were some of the legal strategies that you employed here, or if there are any precedents here? Because as you mentioned, the man who Ms. Vang says raped her, Mr. Pt.2, he had not been charged criminally in connection to raping Ms. Vang. So what kind of legal outlay were you able to provide the jury that caused them to find in Ms. Vang's favor?
Well, the elements of a sex tourism claim are pretty straightforward, Kim. Basically, any United States citizen or permanent U.S. resident who travels from the United States to a foreign country to engage in illicit sexual conduct, it can be found liable of sex tourism. So it's not so much that the elements or the legal elements were in dispute, but I think one thing that will be helpful for cases going forward is that the court made a couple of findings pre-trial which clarify a couple of important attributes. One is that because this was a civil case, the burden of proof on the plaintiff was a preponderance of evidence, as opposed to what everyone's familiar with in a criminal case in terms of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So a preponderance of the evidence standard is much lower. Number two is that the foreign country's laws are irrelevant to the jury's determination. So whether or not a foreign country permits or does not permit a defendant to have illicit sexual conduct in that country does not matter and does not factor into the jury's determination. And then finally, and this was a little bit specific to this case, but there's an exception to in the federal rules of evidence. It's generally pretty difficult to bring in past convictions of a defendant. That's generally not admissible. But there's an exception for past convictions or past sexual assaults. And it's Rule 415 in federal rules of evidence. And so we were able to bring in a past conviction that the defendant had previously been convicted of sexual assault in Minnesota before, and that was something the jury could consider also.
Patrick, what role did Marcia's law play in your strategy?
Well, Marcia's law is the statute that creates a civil cause of action. So in the United States Code, there are a series of criminal statutes that penalize and prohibit a number of criminal acts, whether it's child pornography, whether it's sex trafficking, or in this case, sex tourism. There's a companion statute that says anyone who's a victim of those crimes can bring a civil cause of action, a civil case in federal court. And it gets its name because Marcia was a Russian orphan who was taken into a home of a man in Pittsburgh and was ultimately victimized through child pornography. And this statute was amended in 2006 in her name to make it easier to pursue a civil cause of action in any type of case like that.
And one thing I wanted to emphasize is that the requirement for showing under for the liability is that that the U.S. citizen traveled to another country and raped a child, not to rape a child. So we didn't have to prove that he traveled there in order to rape this child, just that he traveled there and he raped the child.
Linda, you have been working with Pania hands-on really since 2011, and this has been 5 to 6 years in the making. I'm curious, first of all, are there any other types of cases that you are pursuing in this way? Because sex tourism is a multi-billion-dollar business. There are people that take vacations to other countries, specifically to engage in this type of behavior of raping children and committing acts of pedophilia, etc. Do we expect to see more cases like the one you just won in federal court regarding trying to recoup compensation for immeasurable damages done to these victims?
Well, it will be very interesting to see what develops. You know, this is not the only subdivision of of the criminal code that can be enforced under Marcia's law. So we may not see this exact fact situation, but we may see the others start coming through.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's unique about this case, and one of the reasons we haven't seen more cases in U.S. federal courts about sex tourism, is that in most instances, the victim will reside overseas. It will reside in a foreign country, and just as a practical matter, will lack any access to the federal justice system or access to lawyers to be able to pursue such a claim. Here, Pania Vang had immigrated to the United States in conjunction with her father's asylum. So she was in the United States and ultimately obtained access to counsel. And I think that's a key differentiating point. Hopefully, we will have access to more victims and we can pursue more cases like this.
I understand that Ms. Vang declined to comment and make herself available to the press, which is completely understandable. But I am curious, how is she doing? Obviously, she has a new life here in the United States. And you mentioned earlier that she became pregnant as a result of her rape. Was she forced to bear her rapist's child?
I don't think that question was ever in her mind, whether she was going to have the baby or not. She's, of course, residing in a country that doesn't have as many medical education programs as we do in the United States. And so I don't think she ever even considered not having the baby. But, you know, in terms of her suffering, it was significant because of the mores of the culture that she was in that, especially in that rural area, and because of the isolation she felt giving birth and then having to raise a child when she is still a child. And so the suffering was immense, and still suffering when I saw her because she was so afraid of the defendant. And so that suffering, she was genuinely a victim then. But over these years, because of all the support from many organizations, from my organization, from other people, and the media, actually, that she became a very, very powerful speaker on behalf of girls that are being raped over in other countries. And so now she's a survivor. And you may know that in the theories about victims, when they have reached a time period in which it helps them to go forward in their life by speaking out, that is when they're a survivor. And she's a survivor.
Have there been any challenges by her rapist to the amount that he has been now ordered to pay her? Is this judgment likely to stand?
Well, the court did enter judgment on the verdict. The defendant will have a time period to file post-trial motions and file a notice of appeal if he chooses. I think it's a little premature to comment further on that at this time.
But you would probably expect him to appeal this.
The ball's in his court on that issue.
Indeed. So do we have any idea as to when Ms. Vang might actually receive her settlement, or this is still in the works and still probably a little bit of ways away?
It all depends on the timing of how certain motions play out or how an appeal plays out. But ultimately, if the judgment is affirmed, then we'd be looking at working as hard as we can to execute on that judgment. But whether that's several months or over a year, it's always hard to tell.
Linda, given that you advocate and represent for victims of this type of abuse, have you received more inquiries? Have more victims reached out to you after the announcement of this decision was made public?
Yes, I already had an inquiry today.
And do you expect that more people, more victims, even here domestically, because we know that sex tourism is absolutely not limited to Westerners traveling abroad. As I mentioned in my intro, Hawaii just recently passed a law precluding travel agents from arranging vacations specifically designed around sex tourism and criminalized it. I think the penalty is up to 5 years in jail. So are we seeing movement here stateside at least, and at least acknowledging that sex tourism and human trafficking and sex trafficking is without question an epidemic in the United States, and moving towards making sure that these victims have some sort of protections or means to recoup some damages?
Well, several states already have statutes like the one in Hawaii, but we don't in Minnesota. But we've already been contacted by a state representative who is interested in putting that forth in the next legislative session.
Well, I have to commend the both of you for taking on this case and for getting this so far unprecedented settlement for the victim of this horrible attack that she suffered. So we absolutely hope to keep in touch and to see that the outcome is hopefully favorable for Ms. Vang. So we appreciate the work that you both have done on her behalf.
Thank you very much, Kim.
Thank you, Kim.
We've been speaking with Linda Miller. She is an attorney. She's also the founder and executive director of Civil Society, which is a Minnesota-based nonprofit that provides legal assistance for victims of sex trafficking and sexual abuse. And we've also been speaking with Patrick Arenz. He is a trial lawyer at the firm Robbins Kaplan. Thank you both for joining us here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching and supporting the Real News Network.